Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another edition of Pan-Africa Vision, broadcasted to you live from AFRIQUE Media, your Pan-African channel. I'm your regular host, AFRIQUE, taking you through a review of some of the major news events which occurred on the African continent for this week. Particularly in this edition, the 8th edition of Pan-Africa Vision, actually, we're going to be looking at a recent decree in Cameroon, a wonderful West African nation, in which the President of the Republic of Cameroon, Paul Biya, issued a statement through the Minister of Communication, Issa Chiroma, banning some 50 Pentecostal churches in Cameroon, with the subsequent action of an additional 100 to 500 to also follow. After that topic, we will be also drilling and reviewing the situation recently in Ghana, in which the Supreme Court did uphold its verdict sanctioning the winning victory of the NDC in last year's December 2012 elections. Now, with those two topics to take us through the next 1 hour, we went out and searched for a resource person to join us here in this particular panel to help us understand the nature of politics in Ghana. But first, we'll be talking with Mr. Reverend Babila Foncham, who is a religious leader who will be helping us treat this concept of the banning of churches in Cameroon specifically to understand, is it actually being appreciated by the public? Is it relevant, or is the government witch hunting religion? Reverend Babila, welcome to Pan-Africa Vision.
Thank you, Mr. Mbe.
Yes, sir, that is right. And as we have our panelists ready, we are going to first start looking at this first video clip to synchronize us with the situation in Cameroon, noting that it was sometime around the 24th of August in which Cameroon's President Paul Biya ordered the closure of some 50 Pentecostal churches in two of the nation's major cities, as we did point out. We'll just take a brief review of this clip and then we will get back to you.
I think it's a victory for democracy, victory for our constitutional history and development, our electoral laws. It's a time that the Electoral Commission has been brought under test, and the court has seen that yes, the election was transparent, it was free, fair, and the first respondent, who is the president, has been validly elected.
It is now up to all of us Ghanaians to put the dispute behind us and come together to iron out our differences, ease the tensions amongst us, and come together to build our country.
Well, it seems that we have a small mix-up there, but perhaps we'll just instead look at the situation in Ghana first, and then we will come to the incidents in Cameroon after with that particular news clip. So reversing our discussion, we want to start talking about the recent MPP coming up with a challenge of the Supreme Court verdict to rule in the favor of the NDC in Ghana. And interestingly, the MPP was calling on the Supreme Court to cancel some 4 million votes on the premise that the ballots had been tampered with. Now, the MPP was leading and won the presidential elections by 51%, as opposed to the NDC Democratic Congress, NDC, who won 47% of the original Electoral Commission of Ghana's website. And somehow it seems that just some few days later, the NDC was capable of overturning that victory and seizing the government. Now, that was specifically on this basis that the NPP was complaining that they felt there was a slight possibility of voter irregularities in Ghana, and then they decided to petition the Supreme Court to come forward with this decision that they did not want the elections to be recognized in the nation. So first, getting down, of course, into the discourse. With this current ruling, it is evident that perhaps the NPP didn't have enough evidence. So I would just like to ask you now, Reverend Babila, in elections generally, what criteria do you feel actually is needed to prove that an election in Africa may have been somehow manipulated? We noted recently in Zimbabwe, we had the MDC of Morgan Tsvangirai also gave the same complaint, and it seems to be reiterated. I mean, if we see that there's evidence proving that there's a possibility of irregularities, and then the court says there's not enough evidence and rules in the ruling party, what really does substantiate an election may have been manipulated, do you think?
May I begin by saying that the two issues we are looking at today and discussing seem to be interrelated, in the sense that the the government in Ghana or the election body listening to the voice of an opposition that is raised to say that there was some malpractice in the elections means that it is a country that is religious. Because where people have submitted themselves to the will of God, justice surely prevails. I happen to have lived in Ghana for more than 1 year and was witness to some of the elections that took place in the past, like the election where the late Professor Atta Mills contested with John Kufuor for the first time and failed to John Kufuor. I saw the elections right there in Ghana. And one thing you realize in Ghana is that Ghana is a very Christian country. You move along one street and many roads are leading to the church. And again, it is not so much the presence of a church is there, but you actually realize that as you interact with people, people do their possible best to live their Christianity in what they profess by their faith and not just lip service. And so from a religious point of view, I would want to say that there is an exercise of justice with the fear of God as far as the electoral body in Ghana is concerned. But one thing generally in Africa is that we have not taught our children, this begins from childhood, the concept, the notion that one has to accept, to concede, to defeat. Each time we want to engage in something, it is as if we must have to win. You know, it is said that failure teaches success, and there is nothing wrong in failing, but you never fail until you have stopped trying. And so the person who has failed is the person who has ceased to struggle to achieve an end. And therefore, if we learn that fact, then there will be no need for people always to contest elections, even when they know that the issues that they are raising are not justified. But when the issues that are raised are justified, then the electoral body has to listen to the people.
Yes. Now, also linking to that idea, you were bringing up this concept of essentially being a fair loser. Yes,
That's
individuals
right.
should learn to be fair losers, and the winners, of course, should be not necessarily arrogant in their victory, but they should respect the victory and then also respect also the rights and privileges of those who were not as victorious. But specifically, we start to see in African politics regularly that we have opposition parties which are not fair losers, should we say. It's a very common phenomenon, and some people might be tempted to think that the opposition parties use this tactic of always claiming that the ruling party rigged the elections or that it was unfair, there were irregularities, to cover up perhaps that they did weak campaigning or they weren't prepared. Now, does this actually sound really like a basis to look at these ruling party and opposition parties and say that the opposition parties are just not up to par? Could we feel that way?
There is no doubt also that in Africa, the political leaders, those who are in power, really find it difficult to relinquish power. Of course,
Yes,
you will say that one philosopher had said, power is never given on a platter of gold. Power has to be seized. But that should not obtain. You know, we pronounce the word democracy without living up to the expectations of democracy. I take the case of America, and when we look back to the American Declaration of Independence, when they say we hold this truth as self-evident that everybody is created in the image of God, endowed with the equal rights and privileges, and that governments are set in place to safeguard the people, and when it becomes necessary that the government is no longer serving the interest of the people have the right also to depose of that government. But in Africa, the situation is that it is difficult to depose, because they are not saying that you have to use military force to depose a government. You have to democratically unseat the government. But now you realize that in most African states, there's a lot of apathy, voter apathy. You ask for people to go and register. People don't want to register because they say our votes will not count. Nothing changes. One person had said, if you go to most countries, you will steal the results of the elections before the election date. meaning that the elections have been tailor-made, and whatever is being done on election day is camouflage. Whether you vote for A or Y, if it has been decided that it is Y that will win, it doesn't matter where you cast your vote. And I think this is something that the presence of Christianity has to combat against.
Yes. Now, also adding there, if you want to look at the Ghanaian elections, I like how you said you were also in Ghana at one point, because studying their elections, like I was able to prepare this program, we see that their elections relatively have been transparent, because in the past, the margins between the victories have been very slim. Like if you see in this particular election, the NDC won with 50.70% of the votes in the majority, but it's a very slim margin. This was against the 47% of the NPP. Now, the trouble is that the NPP was complaining that they wanted about 4 million votes scrapped, citing that in the south of the country there were some aspects of voter rigging at some of the stations, saying that this would be the reason why they wouldn't want those 4 million votes to be accepted, that there should be a re-vote. Now, if you look at past elections, like you pointed out, even between John Kufuor and John Atta Mills, you see that that issue of a slim margin also crept up again. So even in the past, the NPP has had the presidency in their hand. But this very slim margin makes us start to question that, looking at the elections in Ghana, even in Africa in general, we have a very transparent election. But seeing the slim margin, could this give us the possibility to reason that maybe the NPP did actually win?
Of course, if there is a percentage that has to be attained,
Yes, it's 50%.
and it doesn't look like if somebody has to win you in an election, then it must be a landslide. It can just be even maybe by 0.5%, but then the other person has won. And so, and one thing we have to know, and which obtains, is that no matter who wins, the 47% that is the loser must succumb to the leadership of the winning party and whoever is made head of state. And so I personally do not want to believe that every election that is lost to a party is due to rigging, because if you know that a truly democratic process has been set in motion, then there will be no need quarreling and insisting that there was some rigging. And if the rigging was in favor of the people who complain, they will not complain. Because if you were to look critically, you will realize that those who cry wolf were also involved in rigging somehow. Yes, they must have cheated even to have the percentage that they had as fair losers. And so they should learn to accept failure when it comes to that.
Oh, that's also another very plausible reality, because if you see in a purely democratic situation like Ghana, we could probably assume the NPP, having also ruled the administration and trading off fairly with the NDC, they might have their own mechanism in place to do what it also takes to make the elections come out in the favor they would like it. But unfortunately, a very slim margin. If we're talking 50.70% to 47%, the NDC was just over the actual stipulated minimum by just 0.70%, 0.7%, and it was enough to catapult them into the presidency. Now, interestingly, just like you were pointing out, there have to be fair losers, and we look clearly that the new Patriotic Party president, Akufo-Addo, asked the Electoral Commission of Ghana and its chairman as well that they should instigate a 72 hours withdrawal of the election results law. That is what they wanted to be originally done, though being a fair loser, when the Supreme Court gave its verdict recently, they decided that, okay, they will accept. But going back to this fact that there was a law and provision, and it was invoked, and it's written in the Ghanaian constitution that they had to investigate the electoral fraud. Before even reaching this far, to have the Supreme Court actually rule on the validity of this turnout and then recognize the petition of the NPP, was it right for them to have actually inaugurated President Mahama in the first place, right from January 2013 to the point that he's ruled till now? There's a very slim margin is what we are recognizing. But with this slim margin, we see that the Constitution does, of course, permit a complaint based on the small voting percentage in that margin. But it's about 70.70% above. Now, they're coming to allow a man to continue to be president for about 8 months while they're treating a petition. Was that correct, or should they have suspended Ghana, its presidency, for about 8 months before now giving this ruling?
And now you'll be creating more problems if you have to suspend the presidency. Are you you will be suggesting that they would have to constitute another form of leadership that will have to take on with the government.
Yes, in North Africa, we see interim governments. In Mali, there was
such
an
interim governments, which sometimes end up being the government in place and would not want to give over power. You know, as I told you, I'm looking at politics from a religious point of view and not as a political analyst. I want to believe that when we set up an electoral body, if there is the practice of true democracy that, according to the founder of democracy, I would say, that any government has to have three arms, that is the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. And then we would want to accept that the Supreme Court did their work following democratic principles, and they must have investigated the matter to know exactly where the issues were before making the decision that they made.
Yes, and that is how we look at that situation now. We see it's been free and fair, and just like you're saying, the transparency of the Supreme Court, its investigation, the NPP conceding at last, it's really something modeled for most African countries. And looking at the situation yourself as a clergyman, knowing, of course, fair play, morality, and ethics is what should move any society. What lessons generally can you express to the public? What are your own reflections on what other African states can really learn from this situation?
In fact, while I was driving here, I was listening to music by one Nigerian lady who is saying that Nigerians should go to learn democracy from the late Professor John Atta Mills. And according to this lady, Atta Mills has demonstrated the spirit of true democracy. But I see beyond Atta Mills, I said this, that during the election while I was in Ghana, that Atta Mills contested with John Kufuor. He lost to Kufuor, but during the next election, Kufuor lost to Atta Mills. And here we see a spirit of true democracy, because Ghana actually demonstrated that they are truly the first African independent state, the first African country to achieve independence. And then they have to be the ones to lead other African countries by practicing true democracy. It is true that in the past, Ghanaians lost confidence in Kwame Nkrumah, who was actually the father of the nation, but subsequently founded a state police such that you could not converse at home with your own son or daughter for fear that he had been bought over as a secret spy. And the military rule of Rawlings came in sometimes too. And if in the year that Atta Mills lost to Kufuor, it was simply because most people said Atta Mills was like Rawlings' boy, and people did not like Rawlings, even though he had been a leader of the country for some time, because of what he did. And his attitude toward people sometimes. And so you see in all this, but I keep on emphasizing the fact that my experience in Ghana is that Ghana is a country that is geared towards deep religiosity. And where there is deep religiosity, there's the fear of God. And where there is the fear of God, there is the rule of law and justice.
Yes, essentially. And like we're talking about John Atta Mills, this is going to help us to transition now to our next topic as we are slowly approaching the 35 minutes remaining of the program. Now, it was noted that John Atta Mills was a very religious person. Yes, and actually, we note in his history, before his now of blessed memory, he was very profound in traveling to Nigeria to meet one popularly known televangelist, that is the prophet T.B. Joshua, who has made a name on the African continent and even abroad, specifically with jumbo jets flying to Nigeria to receive his miracles and wonders. Now, interestingly, here in Cameroon, last year we noted that T.B. Joshua was banned by the Cameroonian government, that his organization cannot set itself up in the Cameroon nation, specifically from the premise that the Cameroonian government had investigated and discovered that Cameroonians traveling to Nigeria were facing hardships. Some were being attacked by armed bandits along the way. Some were dying. We had situations in which we have individuals who have gone to the church, according to the Cameroon Foreign Ministry, Foreign Relations, and they explained that individuals who have gone to Nigeria have gone and been actually involved in dubious miracles. That is how the Synagogue Church of All Nations was presented to the Cameroonian public by the Ministry of Foreign Relations, Cameroon's government. And incidentally, this year now, recently, specifically, it was on Thursday, August 23rd in Yaoundé, Cameroon's Minister of Communication, Issa Chiroma Bakari, operating on an order from the president, spoke to the press community as well as certain representatives of heads of Pentecostal churches to announce that that same spirit, should we call it that, behind the TB Joshua movement, which had tried to inculcate itself in Africa as an organization, but exists in the televisions. Now the Cameroon government does not want Pentecostal churches to operate here in Cameroon on this same basis. Now, we note that Issa Chiroma noted that a lot of the Pentecostal churches, as the government has investigated, perform dubious miracles, or we should say questionable miracles, if we want it to be fair. And as well, the Pentecostal clergy now is arguing that the administration is unfoundedly not scapegoating, we should say witch hunting. They could also say scapegoating. They're sending them out into the wilderness to be slaughtered with no premise, on the basis that the Pentecostal churches seem to be very, should I say, critical of the Cameroonian government, denouncing corruption, speaking against what they call diabolic occultism in the ranks of the administration. Now, looking at all of these situations, what is your view on the government's move now to do what they say is uphold law and order in the nation?
Yeah, this is a very sensitive issue because I'm talking as a clergy of one of a denomination that may say the way you are looking at this is because you belong to a certain denomination. But I understand that the Constitution of Cameroon, in its preamble, talk of freedom of religion and freedom of worship. Secondly, I understand that in Cameroon, no church functions without due authorization and permit from the government. In which case now, inasmuch as there is freedom of worship, there is also need to have a document that warrants you to operate as a church. And therefore, if the government decides to ban some churches, it must be that they have not followed the procedure and then do their registration so as to be recognized by the state. Besides, I want to make the correction because you talk so much about the banning of Pentecostal churches. I don't think that the government has banned Pentecostal churches.
Yes, not all.
It is not even Pentecostal churches. There is what we call the new charismatic movements and new religious movements. I say this because I have done an extensive study in what we call African Christianity, the dynamics of Christianity in Africa. It is understood that by the year, it's a projection by historical analysis of the trends and movements of mission. It is analyzed and seen that the rate at which Christianity has multiplied in Africa by geometrical proportions, by the year 2040, Africa will be the continent with the highest number of Christians in the world. But the question is, what type of Christianity?
That is the question.
Is it that type of Christianity where somebody just gets up in the morning and said, as I was sleeping, the Lord told me that I should go and begin a church, and then raise the argument that the disciples of Jesus, they were ordinary fishermen, they did not know, they did not need to go to any theological institution to become a clergy to lead the people.
They're saying it's a calling.
Yeah. Is it not like a blind man leading another blind man through an alley, a dark alley? And the danger is that they both fall into the pit. Because what is the theological interpretation of Scripture? This is the Word of God, true. It is true that you and I can just read a verse and say, because I know you know English, you can understand it. But remember what we call the third person perspective. This book was not written to any of us. It was the various books of the Bible were addressed to particular people at particular times for particular issues. And now we are third-person perspective, reading the documents of other people. And if we have to interpret and understand it in our own day, we have to go back to understand the context in which the people were situated when those books were written to them, and how it was intended for them to understand it. And therefore, we cannot just say the Bible says without proper exegesis, as we say. Exegesis is the reading of meaning out of the text. You need sound theological studies. You need to understand the biblical language in which those books were written, so that you can read the text in that language and understand the meaning and give its right interpretation. That said, it is possible that government's decision, when I read through the list of churches, they are very strange names. And in fact, what you call churches, you call them Pentecostal churches. They are not. If you talk of Pentecostal, there are Pentecostal churches fully established and recognized. You look at the churches like the Apostolic Church, the Full Gospel Church, these are all Pentecostal churches. I don't think that the government has thought. But you are thinking of some sectarian movements that you call churches that are not church. Somebody will just come into the quartier here and start something, and then brainwash the people around, and then they start flocking there because they want to see signs and wonders and miracles, which never do occur in a sense, because the majority of people flock those places for healing, but they still come back and the story is the same. I was in Uganda for some time with TASO, the AIDS Support Organization, on this issue of HIV and AIDS, and I was asking them, what is one of the great challenges that you face? They said the challenge that they face to the problem of HIV and AIDS is the new charismatic movement. Some illiterate ministers who will tell people who are seropositive and who have been placed on antiretroviral therapy and tell them, stop that thing, I have delivered you as I prayed for you, there is no more HIV in you, you don't have HIV or AIDS anymore. And you know that when you are on ARVs, you have to be regular in taking your treatment. And therefore, if you skip some days or some months without taking, by the time you come back, it will have a negative reaction, and so there will be no chances for you to prolong your life. And so that is the borderline, the danger for those people who are ill-informed and then deceive people. If it is about healing, you would not tell people that as a religious authority, when you pray to people, they should no longer take their medication. Jesus even healed using medication. When Jesus used
let me just cut you short there, because as you're talking, I'm reasoning this, objectively, as you're saying that the churches, I'm understanding we shouldn't just generalize the term Pentecostal, but those churches that operate according to these signs and wonders as they are becoming popular, before they are carrying the populations that they are, let's just get this specific fact. Notably in Bamenda, what happens is that a 9-year-old girl, from what I researched, actually died in a church during an exorcism which was being practiced in a Winners Chapel. And notably, Winners Chapel is an internationally renowned spiritual movement of the Pentecostal denomination, churches all over the world. Now, this girl died during this exorcism, and her mother was very distraught and instigated the complaint to the government that brought this final hammer. But Winners Chapel carries a significantly massive population of adherents to this faith. Now, if you're looking at in this context that the miracles are dubious in such establishments, the miracles they perform are not sound, how is it that they're capable of holding such a grand amount of Christians? Surely we would want to believe that some healing is performed, or there's perhaps some type of hypnosis. How can someone go to a church, believe they've been healed in that environment, and then come out and discover that nothing has happened, but they continue to go there?
I would want to cite names, but if the Cameroon government, like you mentioned, did say that they banned the Synagogue Church of God of All Nations in Cameroon because Cameroonians who went to Nigeria were duped or so, we have had to make some statistics too, somewhere where I was living, to note the people who went to the Synagogue Church of All Nations and came back and claimed to have received healing, but who did not outlive again for up to about a month.
Yes,
and there are so many of such cases that are firmly established. And then the question is, why would you spend that much money to go to where...
Selling your property.
We say that you take some of the mainline churches that have been existing. If you take the Catholic Church, that is a universal church worldwide, would you say that all along the years from the foundation of the church, healing has never taken place in that church? And the population, when we talk about the massive population that these people are having, I don't see the massive population. The irony is that most people, it was St. Augustine of Hippo, a great churchman and philosopher, who said humanity is made for God, and as long as he has not found God, his soul remains restless until he finds him. I keep on telling my people that you can go, you will come, because God is not found in churches. The Bible says, don't you know that you are the temple of the Lord and that the Holy Spirit dwells in you? And so if you are the Lord's temple, the church is a place where we meet for fellowship. And when we pray collectively, that God still hears us. But with the Protestant, they say there is the belief in the priesthood of all believers. The priesthood of all believers suggests that you pray, you have a direct channel to pray to God, and God will hear you. And so
but let me add something here, because interestingly, in this notion of the priesthood, what we start to realize is that these churches that are coming up with this authority, they cause their adherents to believe that them as the mouthpiece of God,
of the deity,
that is it, they should be followed. So what we're seeing now is a situation in which the authority of a religious leader, or so-called man of God, anointed man of God as they are referred to, is being rivaled, or actually their adherents believe it's above the state. And that is the situation now that is occurring as these churches have been banned. Their followers are not going to stop continuing to fellowship. They'll hide in their houses and still do it. And we should actually question now, what genuinely does qualify a man of God or a religious person to be recognized as a legitimate spiritual leader? Because those people following these movements, going against what the government now has decreed for their own safety, may continue to still fall victim as far as the government has decreed. Perhaps in their own minds they feel it's okay. But with the idea of the priesthood, and this particular priesthood having this, we don't know where the authority is coming from. They say it's from God. Their adherents are giving it to them. What do you really feel legitimately is the stamp of a true spiritual leader, of a religious leader?
Even in the early church, when the disciples of Jesus in Acts of the Apostles, they started preaching the word of God, they were brought before the Sanhedrin, the council. And one of the leaders of the Sanhedrin stood up and gave some prophetic words which for me hold true even today. Caiaphas, he told them that, my brothers, there was a time that somebody came and claimed to be a Messiah. About 1,000 people followed him, but very soon they just faded off. Another time, another one came with about 400 followers, and suddenly they died down. So these people, if it is that they are of God, then if we want to stop them, we may end up fighting against God. But if it is just by human beings, it will die a natural death just like the others. And I believe that for me, Christianity has stood the test of time. It has not died the natural death. And so I believe that Caiaphas' prophecy is true. And personally, for any of those movements operating, let it be so, that they got the inspiration from God, it can be so. While you just mentioned in a previous discussion, Jonathan Mills, who moved to Nigeria as a head of state, on the reverse, there are great charismatic persons in Nigeria like Duncan Williams and others. And the day Duncan Williams was being consecrated bishop in his cathedral that he's constructed, there were bishops of Pentecostal churches all over the world around there, about 20. And the president of Nigeria sent a representative with a letter that was read in church to say that he would have been personally present on the occasion of the consecration of Duncan Williams. And so people just keep crisscrossing along the globe, looking for God, and whether they find him, I don't know. But why I've cited that situation is because my Ghanaian friends with whom I was at the time, we were watching it. It was a live occasion on TV. They said, this man just started this thing. It's a fake, just duping people. Then I told them that from what I saw on the day of his consecration, he may have been a fake. he may have started it just to gain money, but I want to believe that God has taken possession of the place and the Holy Spirit is now there because of what I saw on stage, on the screen, as the consecration was taking place. I said, this type of incident, God cannot allow his children to be swept away by a lunatic. So God has taken control of the thing. If you can start something as a fake, but somewhere along the line you will
Well, perhaps there could
come
be
to your
a
senses.
change of heart.
Yeah.
Now, we want to look at the situation quite squarely. Coming back now to this aspect, like you said, John Atta Mills, the Nigerian president, the line between government, the line between the state and religion now is becoming very, very blurry, as we're about to see, as this situation will evolve in Cameroon, perhaps, or in other African countries. And generally, it's being fueled by the fact that the economic situation in most African countries is not, should we say, very strong. It's not very stable. And this is why we see this mass proliferation of these, should we say, free churches. Like you said, a young man just decides without any theological orientation that he's read and understood the Bible in a few verses and starts a religious movement, should we call it. Now, we see that this is being started and he's having this mass following. Because actually, if you do go out, the Pentecostal churches seem to be really carrying their numbers to a realistic degree. The individuals you find there are there for some very clear social, economic reasons. Either it's because of wanting to get married, barrenness, feeling persecution by colleagues at work, or perhaps by the family as an issue. But mainly, what has started to be noticed is that most individuals are in these churches for prosperity. They want to amass wealth. And this is something that's not new on this planet. We have names like Benny Hinn from the United States of America, who even has been probed and investigated by the U.S. Senate for his lavish wealth. This is a man who can stay in hotel rooms for the equivalent of 5 million CFA francs per night. Very wealthy. And we see individuals, young African men, Cameroon and other countries, they want to be wealthy. They want to exploit the economic situation that people are desperate for wealth, and they will come to churches where they will hear what has now been coined as prosperity
Gospel
preaching. Yes, prosperity gospel. But can we instead blame the Cameroonian government and those African governments which are not structuring their economies to allow people, youths, who a majority are there, to have their own economic sustenance for this reality that is coming in that is creating this problem? Who are we blaming now? Are we blaming the prosperity preachers who might be taking advantage of a situation, or are we blaming the governments for not giving the foundation so this situation should not exist?
You know, the question links to you. When you were introducing the topic, you said the possibility and the criticism against the government is that because the Pentecostal churches preach against corruption and against bad rulership. But I want to say that contrary to that, those churches dwell so much on the spirituality of the individual and how God will bless the person even in the midst of all the frustrations and hardships. And so this takes us back to what Karl Marx said many years ago, that religion is an opium of the poor. When Karl Marx was saying, Karl Marx was not like he was against religion, but Marx was against that type of religion that would emphasize on biblical passages like, you know, Jesus has said, in my Father's kingdom are many mansions. If it were not so, I will not tell you, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And by preparing the place, so you lift up the spirit of people up to heaven, taking them away from the realities of the present. Before they go to enjoy that mansion in heaven, now, what about here now, in the situation in which they are living? And so you promise them the blessings that will come to them, which are untold. In the course of promising such blessings, you ask them to give all that they have so that they will be blessed. And the man of God is becoming wealthier, like you have just cited the case of Benny Hinn. But what about those Christians who give to the man of God? How wealthy have they become in turn? Where has those blessings that has been promised to them over the years? Because visibly you don't see it.
Actually.
And so it leads to frustration. So such religion becomes an opium that drugs the people to lift them from their frustrations and keep them at a certain state of bliss, and they remain there, and so they tend to worship the founder, the master. we cannot forget too soon the story of Jim Jones.
Is the master of that church.
Yes,
is what you
Jim
mean.
Jones,
Yes.
who gathered about 1,000 Americans and took them to the Guyana, where he gave them cyanide and they all drank and died.
Was that Heaven's Gate, I believe?
Jim Jones.
Yes.
Yes. He was a church minister. And with the promise of salvation, die and your salvation is found in heaven. So mothers held their babies like that. They gave the poison, the children drank, and the mothers kept them down and took their own turn. And 900, close to 1,000 people died at a go. For paradise was promised to them in heaven. I think that is where religion becomes dangerous. We know of what happened in Bamenda some months past in Cameroon, where it was discovered that some people, few men and women, have gathered, and children hardly allowing the people to go out and so on, and one man having all the wives there, having sexual intercourse with the wives of other colleagues and the children of the same mothers with whom he's sleeping. Is that the type of religion that you think will be practiced and the state just sees and folds its arms? Then something is questionable.
Actually, indeed, something is extremely questionable, and that's why we see the government now is coming down to crack on this situation. But as we're looking at this topic now, we start to realize that it's not just even limited to being here in Cameroon now. I was able to dig out some examples, and we started to realize that just even beyond Cameroon as a nation, if you go to Ghana, there was an individual called Nana Kofi Urenki, also known as Jesus One Touch. Now, this was this individual's name. He was the founder of the Jesus Blood Prophetic Ministry, just like you were pointing out. They have very interesting names. And he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for raping his 10-year-old daughter, under the pretext that he declared his reason was that what is called a fetish pastor in Ghana. I'm not sure if you might have come across that concept when you were there. A fetish pastor told him that he should have sexual intercourse with his 10-year-old daughter in order to retain the powers to perform miracles that he was performing in his church. These are some of the realities that are going on in the continent behind these questionable churches. As well, in Kenya, one pastor, Michael Njorage of Fire Ministries, was accused of even paying prostitutes to come into his church and falsify miracles, to actually say that they have had certain manifestations of his power which were not true. Of course, he's denied it, but of course, the situation is there. And in Kenya, they say that pastors even charge fees to perform miracles, and the more difficult the miracle that you want to have performed, the higher rate. And specifically landing on this, like we were just talking about, in Zambia, I wanted to really note this. The Registrar of Societies revoked the certifications of two churches, the Mount Zion Spiritual Church and House of Joy Church International, because 2 of 5 people arrested in connection to the death of a 19-year-old girl were members of these churches, and the government cited that they were ruling them out because of criminal ritual activities. So if we see the Cameroonian government deciding to ban churches, which you pointed out were never legalized, over in Zambia, they revoke the registration of churches that have been legalized.
That's right.
So the situation in Cameroon, it's not new. It's just a reality that is trying to be realized, that this situation needs to be controlled. But to be fair, could any other methods of controlling this problem be employed by the government?
Actually, you know, there was a time the program was being followed in the night to some people who listened to Cameroon's national station, and they said something about one of such sects existing at Toledo, where women were held in bondage and things like that. I think that the long and short of it, the borderline is that governments should create enabling environments for their economies, so as to allow people have a free reign and have better hope for the future, and so that the people should not carry their frustrations to follow any Tom, Dick, or Harry who promises them paradise which will not be achievable.
Yes, that is what the government has to do now. Let's wind back a little bit, because as we started talking, we noted that the Pentecostal churches are taking this position that the government is coming after them. Well, I shouldn't even say Pentecostal churches, because we wrote out that with the strange names that they have, they might not purely be Pentecostal. But there are individuals who preach sermons which are against the government, and they use the premise that they're not only denouncing corrupt practices, but they go as far as giving accusations that senior government officials in Cameroon are members of what they call diabolic or occultic sects, occultic groups. Now they cite names like the Freemason Order, the Amok Rosicrucian Order, or Theosophy. There are several various fraternities, or should we say religious organizations existing that members of the government are or could be a part of, which if you study them on their websites, they promote that they are actually philanthropic fraternal organizations with objectives of promoting world peace. Now, these churches giving these allegations, is there any sound or valid reasoning behind it? They cite and claim that the government officials in Cameroon are supposedly drinking blood or are involved in other bizarre cultic practices, but we've never seen any concrete proof or evidence objectively. Perhaps you've come across this concept. Are these churches right to give such vile accusations?
Well, if they had done so in the past while in their natural order of preaching, then we may say perhaps. But if they can only say it after they have been banned, then something is wrong. If you see something going wrong, and as a church body that has to decry the ills of society and you leave it and go unaddressed, you cannot point them out only when you are affected.
It's not after they're being banned. While they're being operating, we see that they're saying the government now must perhaps have investigated their institutions and realized that certain clergymen in those establishments was giving out such rhetoric from the pulpit.
Of course, it should not only be in those churches. You should find time to worship in other denominations and listen to their messages, whether they decry injustice, whether they decry cultism and occultism, or they just take it for granted that they exist. You know, it is no doubt about it that in governments, not somebody, if you read In God's Name by David Yallo, and we don't want to talk about that concerning the murder of, or the death of Pope John Paul I.
Yes, what was alleged to have been a murder.
He
perhaps.
talks of Opal Dei and the Freemasons, as you say. And I once heard somebody saying that to be somebody of substance politically in this nation, then you must belong to a certain place where power is discussed behind closed doors and not actually on the corridors of political power. But those are hearsays that you cannot stand and tell the nation or the world that this is what is happening. But we, as Africans, we know that these things do exist. For instance, the Rosicrucians, which you mentioned, is not a strange thing in Cameroon. The other day I was preaching in my own congregation and say, if a country should stand up to say that since there's freedom of religion, then the Rosicrucians can openly stand on TV and announce their meetings and we just sit by, then something is wrong. Because what do they stand for? This is in opposition to Christianity, because they don't preach Christ. They have a contrary way by which to attain salvation. And there the problem lies. And so the question, as I was saying, that the issue is that the state should create enabling environment so that people will not be frustrated and maybe go to begin a church, not because God spoke to them as they claim, but simply because out of frustration. I met somebody who said he was discouraged in coming to church because he used to go to church as an African. He went to America where he was staying. There were two Nigerians who were jobless. And one day they just said, bro, in this frustration, let us go and start a church. And they started a church and they became so prosperous. And the church was booming. People were filling the church. Then the man said, if that is the case, I will never go to church again. That if people just sit like this and they say they lack what to do and then they go and start a church and people are flocking there and the church is prospering, then the church is not the church.
Yes. Now, when we started, you also pointed out that Cameroon should be lauded in specific, generally, any country on the face of the planet for recognizing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Right. Now, Article 18 does give the right and guarantee anyone the right to freedom of expression, freedom of religious orientation. So if there is the laudability and freedom of anyone to follow any religion, any religious belief or system that they find, how could now you come with this point that you're trying to counteract that even the fraternal organizations on the planet, because specifically they offer a different route to salvation and recognition of God, they should be instead suppressed?
And I'm not saying they should be suppressed. I'm saying my quarrel begins from the preamble of the Cameroon Constitution, which gives that freedom of religious expression. Religious
Yes, because
expression.
that is what these churches were complaining, that their freedom of expression is being
religious
suppressed.
expression can be the worship of Satan. There is a satanic church with a satanic Bible. All the things that the Holy Bible says, thou shalt not, the satanic Bible said, thou shalt. What the Holy Bible said, thou shalt, the satanic Bible said, thou shalt not. Now, for these other churches, if they are giving the same arguments, my point with them is that while Cameroon is talking about religious toleration, Cameroon also
we have Muslims,
expects,
Buddhists, Jews,
but they
yes.
also expect that churches should be registered. If those churches have been registered, then maybe they would not have been closed down.
Yes, and now this final question will take us out of the studio, because what we've really been debating here is something that Western nations which are developed, like the United States, are really, they're emulated for. Separation of church and state. This is one of the cornerstone and pillars of the United States Constitution, which guarantees free democracy with the right to freedom of expression with religion. I think that's one of the major amendments of their Constitution and Bill of Rights. Now, Cameroon is emulating this as well. Cameroon does represent it. It's just the malpractices of these institutions is what caused it to be now an issue in the government. And other African nations, as we've seen, have seen these problems and have tried to institute their own measures. Now, the gray area between religion and politics. Should a man of God, from his pulpit, address certain political issues which can at last warrant his institution being seen as being subversive to the state? Because we noted that Issa Chiroma, the Minister of Cameroon, was very clear with this point, that these churches are threatening insecurity. And if they're threatening insecurity, it means their rhetorics are inflammatory to the government with some of the statements they make about the administration before even looking perhaps at their religious malpractices.
If the minister was to base on that premise, then it would be, what if some 2 or 3 or 10 ministers of an established denomination that has about 500 congregations spread across the country make some political statements? Will he ban the whole institution that has about millions of Christians, take the Catholic Church or the Presbyterian?
Well, but the question I'm asking is that does politics, does it belong in the pulpit in the first place?
Right. The church is the mouthpiece of the oppressed, the voice of the voiceless, the watchdog of society.
But government officials and politicians are also members of the church.
At first, there was no clear distinction between church and state in the Bible. Israel was a religious community. It was a theocratic state. A theocracy is a state that is ruled by God. And so he had only his mouthpiece on earth who spoke for him. But when the people asked for a king because they admired the kings of other nations, God told the prophet Samuel, give them the king. That is how they have been behaving to me. And so you had the first king, Saul, David, and so on. Then so state was separated from religion. But you will realize that it was Solomon who built the first temple. It was his father who gathered the material. Subsequently, the church was separated from the state until Emperor Constantine had to fuse his state to make his state a Christian state. And so there was no outright division between state and church. Otherwise, the church and the state ought to function together. But the church must remain critical of the state.
But what you're doing, you're giving a model which is limited to a particular culture. That would be the Jewish culture. In other societies and systems, that might not be the case, is what we should really look at. Perhaps, I wasn't supposed to take it, but as we're running out of time, I'm going to have to cut you there and give that conclusion, that a line has to be drawn to a certain extent, because in a state there must be peace, there must be order, there must be security. And just like you pointed out that there was an individual who led people to even drink cyanide to kill themselves because of religious beliefs, these went now contrary to the ethics and regulations of the state. So any government has that priority to protect its citizens where they see any belief being preached which might be inflammatory and even against the well-being of individuals, not from a point of view of Christianity or Islam or any religious doctrine or position, but from a secular point of view of promoting human rights. And that is where we're going to have to end this edition of Pan-Africa Vision. I really want to thank my guest who came into the studio with us, Mr. Reverend Babila, who has been very monumental. Reverend, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
As we were treating those issues, looking at the ban of Pentecostal or churches operating under the Pentecostal movement in Cameroon, which was recently passed by the government, and the verdict of the Supreme Court in Ghana to uphold the victory of President John Mahama of the NDC. That takes us away. I've been Ambe Fokwa for a presentation, bidding you to stay tuned to your Pan-African channel, AFRIQUE Media, as we'll bring you more programming. We'll see you in the next rotation. Thank you.